I'll start by quoting a proverb that Chinua Achebe used in an interview that he gave in the Paris Review in 1994, where he said that until the lions have their own historians, the history of the hunt will always glorify the hunter. This aphorism neatly captures some of what is at stake here in our discussion of narratives of power and memory. In effect, whose understandings come to be legitimated as history, and whose remain simply as memories. As well as considering who gets to tell histories, there is also the related question of how these histories are framed and structured. Specifically, there is a failure to acknowledge the significance of colonial histories to the emergence of what are generally understood as nation-states within Europe. And this failure has consequences for the shaping of politics within Europe as well as globally. And the latter I'll discuss at greater length at the end of my brief remarks here. I'll frame my initial remarks, however, in the context of the last 2 decades in Europe. 2 decades that were inaugurated by high-level proclamations of the death of multiculturalism, at the same time as European societies were becoming increasingly diverse. 2 decades which have seen the growth of ethno-national movements and the mainstreaming of exclusionary narratives, with the language of go home being replaced, for example, with seemingly politer calls for re-migration. The political issues at hand are shaped by the histories we acknowledge, as well as by those that we fail to recognize. As a character in Salman Rushdie's novel, The Satanic Verses notes, the trouble with the English is that their history happened overseas, so they don't know what it means. This is as true, I would suggest, for France, Germany, Finland, and Europe at large. While the famines in India under British colonial rule and consequent colonial policies there may not be remembered in Britain, nor deemed significant to Britain's understanding of itself as democratic or the shaping of its institutions, they are remembered by those who survived the famines and their descendants. While the massacres in Algeria on the first Victory in Europe Day in May 1945 may not be remembered in France, they are remembered by those who survived and by their descendants. When 5 years later, as P.O. Hansen argues, the Schuman Declaration announced that Franco-German coal and steel initiative, inaugurating what would become the EU's self-proclaimed core principles of peace and solidarity, it did so at the same time as Schuman was overseeing a brutal colonial war in Indochina, killing as many as 500,000 Vietnamese. While the EU necessarily has to forget these histories in order to celebrate the spirit of the Schuman Declaration as a plea for world peace, those who survived and their descendants have different memories of their shared and connected histories. The failure to recognize these other memories and make them part of our histories is not individual, but systemic. It is a failure associated with the power of a particular narrative, that of modernity, or the rise of the West more generally. This narrative shapes both our academic disciplines as well as public understandings, while, as North American historian William McNeill acknowledges, it expresses history from the point of view of the winners. This, he suggests, should not be regarded as a limitation. Rather, he goes on, we should, and I quote, admire those who pioneered the enterprise and treat the human adventure on Earth as an amazing success story, despite all the suffering entailed. As Walter Rodney had earlier observed, to be colonized is to be removed from history except in the most passive sense. Colonization is not part of the story of the success McNeill otherwise celebrates. It is only recognized in terms of a generalized suffering, which is regarded as being outside of history. This double erasure, where we are enjoined to celebrate the successes of some despite the suffering of others, entailed by a purportedly inclusive human adventure, forms the nub of post-colonial critique. The point is not simply to seek inclusion in history, have different voices, different memories be recognized. It is also, as Qadri Ismail argues, to besiege the disciplines and to transform the narratives that undergird them. The argument here is not for pluralism as a solution to previous exclusion. It is for inclusion to make a difference to dominant narratives. The West did not rise separate from its colonial activities. These histories need to be acknowledged and accounted for in their own terms, and the difference such understandings make to politics in the present needs to be considered. The idea of the modern political community as a national political order, for example, is central both to European self-understanding and to the organisation of rights and entitlements in the present. One consequence of the failure to address colonial histories is the ongoing reproduction of associated inequalities into the present. This is perhaps most potently highlighted in the debates over migration, where any number of commentators from across the political spectrum rail against the idea of using national taxes to support refugees and asylum seekers, or then to contribute to overseas development aid. Their arguments tend to be based on the idea that the national patrimony available for distribution within European welfare states is made up of wealth generated through the activities of national citizens over time. As such, its use and distribution ought to be regulated for the people properly understood, whose contributions and efforts it is said to represent. And yet, as I've argued, the colonial contributions to Europe are not insignificant. In the context of Britain, a report in 1884 by Richard Temple stated that over half of the annual revenue available to the British national government came from the taxes, labour and resources of those within its empire, beyond the national state. Colonial taxes, then, were used to fund welfare and public goods in the nation while being denied to the populations from whom the taxes were raised. This is where the asymmetry of what is remembered resonates so acutely in contemporary politics. Taxation, and the ways in which it is returned to citizens through welfare, is one of the main ways in which the imagined community of the nation comes into being, as a social contract among citizens. If we were to recognize that this imagined community was built not only through national taxes, but also colonial ones, then how might that enable us to more effectively challenge the politics of resentment prevalent today? Speaking of today, I'd like to return to the question of global politics that I alluded to at the outset. The actions and pronouncements of the US government in the first 2 weeks of 2026 have begun to be framed, even within the mainstream media, in terms of a return to empire. The evidence for this is presented as the colonial era practices of resource extraction, political domination, and mercantilism, that is, the requirement to sell raw materials under external direction and to use the proceeds to purchase goods and services only from the dominant, that is, colonizing country. These are practices that are understood to have ended with the Second World War and with the development of a new international order built on multilateral institutions that would constrain great power aggression. While it is useful for colonial practices to be recognized as such in the immediate present, what is less helpful is the failure of commentators to understand how integral they have been to the success of European states, both individually and collectively, both historically and well into the 20th century. In the decades after the end of the Second World War, for example, Britain required its remaining colonial territories, Nigeria, Ghana, Malaya, to sell their raw products on the global market and to put the dollars earned into a dollar pool in London, controlled by the British government. In this way, as David Fieldhouse argues, British colonies were made to tie up funds that they might otherwise have used for their own development in order to give Britain cheap credit and to subsidize Britain's post-war standard of living. In a similar vein, during the negotiations that led to the Rome Treaty in 1957, the EEC set out the following, and I quote, "Economically speaking, the European member states of the common market have an essential need for the cooperation and support that the overseas territories, particularly the African ones, are able to offer. In addition to mineral resources, it's fair to mention the results of very recent prospections in the petroliferous area carried out in connection with the systematic inventorying of the immense African reserves of metals, phosphates, hydraulic energy, etc. As Hansen and Johnson have set out at length in their book Eurafrica, Not only were Europe's African colonies unquestionably put at the service of the incipient European project, but there was a stronger statement, that Europe's unification could succeed only if it was fashioned also as the joint colonization of Africa. What we're witnessing today is not straightforwardly a departure from the rules-based international order, but a clearer expression of how that order has, for the most part, been constructed and certainly experienced by much of the world. Until we take seriously the colonial histories that have configured our contemporary world, we will not be able to act effectively in it. Plus échange.